My mom gave birth to me just so I could cure my sister's leukemia and had me do multiple procedures and bone marrow extractions with a giant needle without so much as a hug afterward. When I asked if we could stop, she said, "We created you to save your sister. That's your purpose." And my sister called me her walking medicine cabinet. I stayed silent. That was years ago. Now my sister is only a memory, and my parents got the karma they deserve. I was born to be harvested. My parents had my sister Holly first. She was diagnosed with leukemia when she was 4. They tried everything, from chemo, radiation, experimental treatments. Nothing worked long term. Her cancer kept coming back, each time more aggressive than before. When this happened for the billionth time, my parents decided to have a savior sibling. Basically, they'd have another child, me, who would be a perfect genetic match to provide bone marrow, blood, and whatever else Holly needed. I found out that I was only born to be her organ donor when I was 7. Before that, I just thought all kids spent half their lives in hospitals getting poked with needles. I didn't know any different. My earliest memory is being in a hospital bed. I must have been about 3. I remember crying because my arm hurt from where they took blood. The needle seemed enormous to my toddler eyes, and the pinch felt like fire running through my veins. My mom was there, but she wasn't comforting me. She was just checking her watch and asking the nurse how much longer it would take. As soon as they were done, she rushed me out of there to get back to Holly, not even pausing to wipe away my tears or offer a reassuring hug. That was pretty much how it always went. Holly was the real child. I was just the walking pharmacy. The difference in the way they treated us was stark. Despite me being healthy, I never had birthday parties growing up. Holly did, though, whenever she was well enough. She'd have big ones with all her friends from school, and tons of presents wrapped in shiny paper with colorful bows. I was never allowed to join because I might expose Holly to germs after one of her treatments, so I just watched from the stairs. I sat there for hours, hugging my knees to my chest, watching other children laugh and play games while my parents fawned over Holly. My birthdays usually involved a trip to the hospital for some kind of donation procedure, maybe a small cake afterward if I didn't cry too much during whatever they did to me that day. Once, when I turned 13, the nurse snuck me a cupcake handle. She let me make a wish before my parents came back to the room. I wished for someone to love me for me. I used to try really hard in school, thinking maybe if I got good grades, my parents would notice me for something other than my matching blood type. I brought home an award for a science project in second grade. I'd spent weeks working on a detailed model of the solar system with hand-painted planets and carefully measured orbits. My mom glanced at it and said, "That's nice," before asking if I'd taken my iron supplements because they needed to draw more blood that weekend. The certificate ended up crumpled at the bottom of my backpack. I stopped trying after a while. Holly wasn't nice to me either. When she felt good, which wasn't often, she'd find ways to remind me why I existed. She'd call me her walking medicine, cabinet, or spare parts. Once when I was about 6, I found her going through my dresser. When I asked what she was doing, she said she was checking what was hers. She told me my kidneys, my bone marrow, and my blood all belonged to her. I believe her for years. Sometimes at night, I'd stay awake wondering which parts I might lose next. I couldn't have friends over either to escape the loneliness I felt because our house revolved around Holly's health. Everything was sterilized constantly. My parents were terrified I'd catch something and then wouldn't be able to donate. I basically lived in a bubble, but not for my protection, for hers. I remember one girl from school, Lily, who wanted to come over to play. When I asked my mom, she looked horrified and lectured me for an hour about how selfish I was being, risking Holly's life for something as trivial as friendship. By the time I was 9, things got worse. I overheard the doctors talking to my parents about a partial liver transplant. I didn't fully understand what that meant, but I knew it sounded scary and permanent. The thought of surgeons cutting me open and taking out a piece of my organ made me sick with fear. I tried telling my teacher at school that I was scared about an operation. She just patted my head and said, "Sometimes we have to do things we don't want to for the people we love." That's when I realized nobody was going to help me. I was completely alone in this. My parents never bothered to explain the procedures to me beforehand. They'd just wake me up and say, "We're going to the hospital today." I'd find out what they were doing to me when I was already there, already dressed in the hospital gown. The doctors would try to explain things to me sometimes, but my parents would cut them off and say I'd already consented. I don't think the doctors liked it, but they never stopped it either. I remember this one time when I was 15. I had to have bone marrow extracted. If you've never experienced that, consider yourself lucky. They stick this huge needle into your hip bone. It hurts like hell, even with local anesthetic. I was crying and begging them to stop. The pain was like nothing I'd ever felt before, like someone was drilling into my very core. My mom just stood there telling me to be brave for Holly. Not for me, for Holly. After it was over, they went straight to Holly's room. I was left alone with a nurse who looked sorry for me, but didn't say anything. I stayed there crying and wondering if anyone would notice if I just disappeared. The only person who ever treated me like a real person was my Aunt Sarah. She's my mom's sister, and she's a nurse. She didn't live nearby, so I only saw her a couple times a year at family gatherings. But whenever she came, she'd bring me presents just for me, not shared with Holly. She'd ask about my interests, my friends, not that I had many, what books I liked to read. Normal aunt stuff felt extraordinary to me. She'd brush my hair gently and tell me I was beautiful, smart, and important. When I was 8, we had a big family Thanksgiving dinner. Holly was doing okay that month, so everyone came to our house. I remember Aunt Sarah watching me closely during dinner. I wasn't allowed to eat certain foods before procedures, so I was picking up plain turkey while everyone else had all the sides. After dinner, she found me alone in the hallway and asked if I was okay. Something about the way she asked made me start crying. I told her about the constant hospital visits, how I was scared about the liver thing they kept mentioning, how nobody ever asked if I wanted to do these things. I didn't know it then, but that conversation changed everything. Aunt Sarah started visiting more often after that. She'd bring me little gifts and take me for ice cream when my parents would allow it, which wasn't often since sugar was bad for my system, according to them. During these visits, she'd ask casual questions about my medical procedures. I didn't realize she was gathering information. One day when I was 17, I overheard my parents arguing with Aunt Sarah in the kitchen. She was saying words like unethical and exploitation. My dad yelled that she had no right to judge them when she'd never had a dying child. My mom was crying, saying they were just doing what they had to do to save Holly. Aunt Sarah said, "But at what cost? Mia is a child, not a resource." I pressed myself against the wall outside the kitchen, heart pounding, both terrified and strangely hopeful that someone was finally fighting for me. After that fight, Aunt Sarah wasn't allowed to visit anymore. My parents told me she was causing problems and needed to mind her own business. I felt more alone than ever. The one person who saw me as Mia, not Holly Donor, was gone. I started keeping a journal hidden under my mattress, writing letters to Aunt Sarah that I could never send. A few months later, there was a knock at our door. I opened it to find Aunt Sarah with a woman in a suit who introduced herself as someone from Child Protective Services. My parents went ballistic. My dad tried to physically block them from entering, and he was red in the face. My mom grabbed me and pulled me behind her, screaming at Sarah that she was calling Holly. It was chaos. I remember standing there frozen in shock as the adults shouted over each other. I was taken to another room with the CPS woman while the adults argued. She asked me questions about my life, my medical procedures, if I understood why they were done, if I'd ever been asked for my consent. I answered honestly because no one had ever really asked me these things before. I showed her my arms with all the needle marks. I told her about the bone marrow extractions, the blood draws, the talk of taking part of my liver next. That was the beginning of what turned into a huge legal battle. I didn't understand most of it at the time. There were court hearings where I had to talk to a judge in private. Medical ethics experts testified. My parents brought in Holly doctors who said she would die without my donations. Aunt Sarah brought in child psychologists who talked about the trauma I was experiencing. The worst part was that during all of this, I was still living at home with my parents. They barely spoke to me except to remind me that if Holly died, it would be my fault. It always made me feel guilty, especially since Holly was sicker than that closet with flashlight. Reading books Aunt Sarah had smuggled to me, fantasy stories about kids who discovered they had magical powers or secret identities. I wished so badly that someone would come tell me I was actually a princess from another world who had been switched at birth. Anything to escape the reality that I was just a collection of spare parts for someone else. The court case dragged on for months. My parents were fighting with everything they had. They truly believed they were right, that sacrificing one child to save another was the only moral choice. I heard my dad tell the judge, "We created Mia to save Holly. That's her purpose." Like I was a medication they'd invented, not a person. I started having nightmares around this time. I dreamed that I was on an operating table, and doctors were removing pieces of me one by one while my parents watched approvingly. I'd wake up screaming, and no one would come to comfort me. I'd lie there in the dark, heart racing, sweat soaking, my pajamas, trying to convince myself that I was still whole. School became my only escape. I threw myself into my studies, staying late in the library just to avoid going home. My grades were perfect, not that my parents noticed. One teacher, Miss Winters, started paying special attention to me. She'd wussband, give me extra books to read and let me eat lunch in her classroom. I think she knew something was wrong, but didn't know how to help. As the court case continued, medical experts testified about something called medical child abuse. I didn't fully understand it then, but they were saying that subjecting me to repeated painful procedures without medical necessity for me was a form of abuse, even if it was helping Holly. They talked about my rights to bodily autonomy and informed consent. My parents' lawyer argued that parents make medical decisions for their children all the time, and this was no different. But the judge asked a question that stuck with me. If Holly needed a heart, would you take me as? My father hesitated too long before answering. No, of course not. Everyone in the courtroom could see he was lying. About 11 months into the legal battle, I had my 13th birthday. No one in my family remembered it. Miss Winters gave me a cupcake at school, and Aunt Sarah sent a card that my parents intercepted. I found it later torn up in the trash. The next day, the judge made his final ruling. I was immediately removed from my parents' custody and placed with Aunt Sarah as my temporary guardian. I remember the court officer helping me pack a small bag while my mother screamed that I was murdering my sister. My father just sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly ahead like he couldn't process what was happening. As I walked out of that house with Aunt Sarah's arm around my shoulders, I felt both terrified and relieved. I had no idea what would happen next, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't just a medical resource. I was Mia. Aunt Sarah lived in a small apartment about 7 hours away from my parents. It had only one bedroom, so she set up a futon in the living room for herself and gave me the bedroom. I remember being shocked that she'd give up her own room for me. No one had ever put my comfort first for. First night there, couldn't sleep. I kept waiting for someone to wake me up for a hospital visit or a blood draw. When morning came and no one had disturbed me, I actually cried from relief. Aunt Sarah found me sobbing and just held me, not asking questions, just being there. That first week was strange. Aunt Sarah asked what foods I liked, what clothes I wanted to wear, what I wanted to do each day. Having choices was overwhelming. After a lifetime of being told what to do, I kept asking permission for basic things like using the bathroom or getting a glass of water. Each time Aunt Sarah would gently remind me that I didn't need permission to meet my own needs. I'd been with Aunt Sarah for about 7 weeks when we got the news that Holly's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Without my donations, her body was rejecting the previous treatments. I felt this weird mix of guilt and relief. Part of me felt terrible that someone was suffering because of me, but another part, a part I was ashamed of, felt validated, like court had been right to remove me from that house. Aunt Sarah never pressured me about it. She just told me what was happening in a calm, matter-of-fact way, then asked if I had any questions. When I asked if I was calling my sister by not donating anymore, she sat me down at her kitchen table and looked me straight in the eyes while she said, "Mia, you are not responsible for keeping another person alive at the expense of your own health and well-being, not even your sister." Once it was the first time anyone had ever said something like that to me, I burst into tears right there at the table. Aunt Sarah just held my hand and let me cry it out. My parents tried everything to get me back. They filed appeal after appeal. They went on local news channels talking about how I was their daughter's only hope. They even had Holly record a video from her hospital bed begging me to stop being selfish and just do the right thing. She was so pale and thin and had dark eye circles. I almost caved, but Aunt Sarah reminded me that my parents were the adults who had put both of us in this impossible situation. The court appointed me a therapist, Dr. Kaplan. Her office had this big, comfy couch where I'd sit hugging a pillow while we talked. At first, I didn't say much. I was scared that anything I said might somehow get back to my parents or be used against me in court. "Mia, everything you tell me stays between us," she assured me during our second session. "This is your safe space to talk about anything you're feeling." Slowly, I started opening up. I told her about the nightmares, about how I sometimes checked my body for missing parts when I woke up. I told her about Holly's cruelty and my parents' indifference. I told her about hiding in closets and bathrooms just to get a moment of peace. With each session, it felt like weights were being lifted off my shoulders. About a month after I moved in with Aunt Sarah, we had to go back to court. My parents had filed an emergency petition claiming that without immediate access to my bone marrow, Holly would die within weeks. They wanted the court to order a one-time donation. I remember sitting in the courtroom, scared out of mind. I was still scarred from the previous bone marrow procedure. The judge asked to speak with me privately in his chambers. He didn't talk down to me like most adults did. "Mia, do you understand what your parents are asking for?" he asked. I nodded and told him I did. I explained the bone marrow procedure in detail from the perspective of the donor. I told him about the pain, the recovery time, the risks. His eyebrows went up, clearly surprised that a 10-year-old could describe a medical procedure so clinically. "And how do you feel about doing this procedure again?" he asked. I took a deep breath. "I'm scared," I admitted. "It hurts a lot, and I don't think it would be just one more time." "It never is," the judge nodded. Then he asked me something no one had ever asked before. "What do you want for your future, Mia?" The question caught me off guard. I'd never been allowed to think about my future as separate from Holly. After a moment, I told him I wanted to go to school regularly, maybe join a club and make friends, normal kid stuff that had always been impossible before. The judge denied my parents' petition. He ruled that forcing me to undergo a painful, invasive procedure against my will would constitute assault. He also made Aunt Sarah my permanent legal guardian and granted a restraining order against my parents. They couldn't come within 505 FT of me or contact me directly. When we left courthouse, there were reporters waiting. My parents were giving a tearful interview about how the justice system had signed their daughter's death warrant. Aunt Sarah shielded me from the cameras and rushed me to her car. I ducked down in the back seat as we drove away, feeling both powerful and terrible at the same time. 2 weeks later, Holly died. I found out when I came home from school and found Aunt Sarah waiting for me with a serious expression. She sat me down and told me gently, even though I'd been expecting it, the news hit me like a physical fatal blow. I ran to the bathroom and threw up. Then I locked myself in Aunt Sarah's bedroom and cried for hours. I wasn't crying because I missed Holly. How could I miss someone who'd never shown me kindness? I was crying because a 14-year-old girl had died, and because on some level, I felt responsible. I was crying because my parents had put me in a position where I had to choose between saving myself and saving my sister. No kid should ever have to make that choice. Aunt Sarah gave me space that day, just checking in occasionally to make sure I was okay. When I finally came out of the bedroom, red-eyed and exhausted, she had made my favorite dinner, mac and cheese with hot dogs cut up in it. Such a simple thing, but it meant everything to me that she remembered my favorite comfort food. Do I have to go to the funeral? I asked her that night. No, honey. You don't have to do anything you don't want to do, she replied. That's the whole point. I decided not to go. Couldn't face my parents. Couldn't bear to see Holly laid out in a casket. Couldn't stomach the accusatory stare from relatives who'd been told I'd chosen to let my sister die. Instead, Aunt Sarah and I had our own small memorial. We went to a park and released a balloon with a message I'd written. I'm sorry things couldn't be different. The aftermath of Holly's death was ugly. My parents gave interviews blaming me. The courts and Aunt Sarah. Extended family members I barely knew sent hateful messages. Someone even created a social media page called Justice for Holly with my school picture on it, calling me a murderer. Aunt Sarah reported it and got it taken down, but not 4 kids at school had seen it. Going to school became a nightmare. Whispers followed me down the hallway. That's her? The girl who called her sister? Someone spray-painted color on my locker. I started having panic attacks in the middle of class, my heart racing so fast I thought I might die. The school counselor tried to help, but she was way out of her depth. After a particularly bad incident where some kids cornered me in the bathroom, Aunt Sarah decided we needed to move. She requested a transfer at the hospital where she worked as a nurse, and within a month, we relocated to a small town in Utah, about 1,000 miles from my old life. She legally changed my last name to hers, Crawford, instead of Thompson, to give me a fresh start. Our new place was a tiny 2-bedroom house with a yard. For the first time, I had my own room that was actually meant to be a bedroom, not a medical supply closet with a bed in it. Aunt Sarah let me pick out the paint color, light blue, and bedspread covered in stars. I spent hours just sitting in that room, amazed at the fact that it was mine, that no one would come in and take blood or bone marrow or anything else from me there. Starting at a new school was scary, but also liberating. No one knew my history. I was just Mia Crawford, the new girl from out of state. I could reinvent myself. I could just be normal, except I didn't know how to be normal. I flinched when people touched me unexpectedly. I hoarded food in my backpack, a habit from years of restricted diets before procedures. I had no idea how to make friends or have casual conversations. The other kids thought I was weird. Aunt Sarah found me a new therapist, Dr. Torres. She specialized in trauma and children who'd experienced medical abuse. Our sessions were different from the ones with Dr. Chaplin. Aside from talking, we also did activities designed to help me process my experiences. I made a timeline of my life, marking medical procedures in red and positive experiences in blue. The paper was mostly red until the point where Aunt Sarah took custody of me. What do you notice about this timeline? Dr. Torres asked me. My life sucked, and now it doesn't, I said. She smiled. I see a very resilient young person who survived an extremely difficult childhood and is now building a new life. I didn't feel resilient. I felt broken. I had nightmares. Almost every night, I struggled to trust anyone besides Aunt Sarah. I jumped at loud noises. I had this constant feeling that something bad was about to happen, that this new life was temporary and I'd be sent back to be harvested again. Dr. Torres taught me coping strategies after I told her all that. Deep breathing exercises, grounding, techniques, positive self-talk. Some days they helped, other days nothing worked to soothe the ball of anxiety permanently lodged in my chest. About 11 months after we moved, I had a major breakthrough in therapy. Dr. Torres had me write letters to everyone involved in my trauma. I didn't have to send them. They were just for processing feelings. The letter to my younger self broke. Something open in me. I wrote, "Dear little Mia, I'm so sorry no one protected you. I'm sorry you had to be brave when you should have been allowed to just be a kid. I'm sorry you were treated like a collection of spare parts instead of a whole person. You deserved better. You deserve to be loved for who you are, not what you could provide. I promise I will never let anyone treat you that way again." I sobbed so hard writing that letter that Dr. Torres had to end our session early. Aunt Sarah found me in the backseat of her car afterwards, still crying. She didn't ask questions, just drove home and sat with me while I cried myself to sleep on the couch. The next day, something had shifted. I felt lighter somehow, like I'd finally acknowledged the hurt that little girl had experienced. I started standing up straighter. I raised my hand in class. I even smiled at a girl named Zoe, who sat next to me in English. Zoe became my first real friend. She didn't seem to care that I was awkward and jumpy. She just liked that I was smart and would help her with homework. We started having lunch together, then hanging out after school. Her family was loud and chaotic since she had 3 brothers, 2 dogs, parents who worked multiple jobs, but they welcomed me like I belonged there. there. The first time Zoe invited me for a sleepover, I panicked. I'd never slept anywhere but hospitals and my parents' house before moving in with Aunt Sarah. The idea of staying overnight at someone else's home was terrifying. What if I had a nightmare? What if I woke up in the middle of the night sobbing? I almost canceled, but Aunt Sarah encouraged me to try. You can always call me to come get you. No questions asked, she promised. But I think this could be good for you, Mia. So I went. Zoe's mom made homemade pizza and let us put whatever toppings we wanted on it. Her dad taught us how to play poker using M&Ms as chips. Her brothers teased us, but in a friendly way, not the cruel way Holly used to. It was noisy and messy and wonderful. That night, I did have a nightmare. I woke up gasping, convinced I was back in the hospital with needles in my arms. But instead of being alone, Zoe was there. She didn't make a big deal of it, just asked if I wanted some water, and then started telling me about this book series she was reading until I calmed down. I started making other friends too. There was Marcus from my science class who was obsessed with robots, and Chase who played guitar and taught me a few chords. Slowly, I was building a life that had nothing to do with being a donor or a victim or a survivor. I was just Mia, a regular teenager with friends and homework and a favorite, Spot, the local ice cream shop. Aunt Sarah supported me every step of the way. She came to my school events, helped with projects, and celebrated my achievements. When I got an A on a particularly difficult math test, she put it on the refrigerator, something my parents had never done. She took pictures of me constantly, creating the childhood photo album I'd never had. She introduced me as her daughter, not her niece. And each time she did, I felt more secure in my place in the world. When I turned 19, Aunt Sarah threw me my first real birthday party. She invited my new friends, decorated the house with balloons and streamers, and baked a cake from scratch. She even hired a photographer. I felt awkward being the center of attention, but also deeply happy. That night, after everyone had gone home, Aunt Sarah gave me a small velvet box. Inside was a silver necklace with a pendant shaped like a bird breaking free from a cage. "To remind you that you're free now," she said, helping me put it on. "Your body is your own, Mia. Your life is your own." I wore that necklace every day. I still do, actually. Unfortunately, the legal battles didn't end with Holly's death. My parents tried to sue Aunt Sarah for wrongful death. They tried to get visitation rights. They even attempted to challenge the guardianship by claiming Aunt Sarah had manipulated me and turned me against them. None of it worked. But each new filing meant more court appearances, more anxiety, more nightmares. About a year after we moved to Utah, the harassment finally stopped. I later found out that my parents had divorced. Apparently, they couldn't stay together without Holly to focus on. Without me to blame in person, they turned on each other. My mom moved back to her hometown in Michigan. My dad just disappeared. Life settled into a new normal. I joined the debate team at school and discovered I had a talent for constructing logical arguments. I started thinking about becoming a lawyer someday, maybe helping other kids in situations like mine. I even went on my first date with a boy named Nick from my history class. It was awkward and we had nothing in common, but it felt like such a normal teenage thing to do. But the trauma didn't just disappear. I still had triggers. Blood draws at routine doctor visits sent me into panic attacks. The smell of hospital. Disinfectant made me nauseated. Certain medical dramas on TV were completely unwatchable for me. And I had this persistent fear that my parents would somehow find me and force me to donate again. When I was 12, that fear almost came true. I was at school when the office called me down. There was a woman waiting there who introduced herself as a lawyer representing my father. She said he wanted to reconcile and asked if I would be willing to meet with him. I started hyperventilating right there in the school office. The secretary had to call Aunt Sarah to come get me. It turned out my father had hired a private investigator to find us. Aunt Sarah immediately filed for a new restraining order, which was granted. We also learned that my father had developed leukemia himself, the same type Holly had. The genetic component that had made me a match for Holly would make me a match for him too. He wasn't looking to reconcile, he was looking for a donor. That incident set me back months in therapy. I started having the nightmares again, started checking the locks on doors and windows obsessively. I became convinced that my father would kidnap me and force me to give him bone marrow. Dr. Torres helped me work through the fear, but it never fully went away. To help me feel more secure, Aunt Sarah enrolled me in a self-defense class. The instructor, a former military woman named Sergeant Rodriguez, took a special interest in me. She didn't know my full story, but she could tell I was dealing with serious trauma. She taught me not just how to physically defend myself, but how to project confidence, how to be aware of my surroundings, and how to trust my instincts. "Stand tall, Mia," she'd tell me. "You take up space in this world. You have every right to be here and to protect yourself." By 21, I was doing much better. I had a solid group of friends, good grades, and activities I enjoyed. I still saw Dr. Torres, but we'd reduce sessions to once a month. I still had bad days. Anniversaries were especially hard, like Holly's birthday or the day she died, but they became less frequent. Aunt Sarah and I developed traditions of our own. Sunday morning pancakes, movie nights on Fridays, summer road trips to national parks. We took silly pictures at those tourist trap photo studios, dressed up as cowgay, girls or pirates. We built the kind of family album I'd never had growing up, full of smiles and inside jokes and memories that had nothing to do with hospitals. When I was 14, I got my driver's license. Aunt Sarah surprised me with a used Honda Civic. The freedom of being able to go places on my own was intoxicating. Sometimes I just drive around town with the windows down, music blasting, reveling in the ability to control where I was going. That same year, I started researching colleges. Aunt Sarah took me on college tours during spring break, walking across those campuses, imagining a future where I was just a normal student with normal concerns. Felt surreal, but wonderful. I applied to 7 schools and got accepted 5, including my top choice, a small liberal arts college in Vermont with a strong pre-law program. When the acceptance letter came, Aunt Sarah and I danced around the kitchen like lunatics. She'd been saving for my education since the day she got custody of me, setting aside whatever she could from her nursing salary. I always knew you could. Do it, she told me, her eyes shining with tears. I'm so proud of you, Mia. Baked school graduation was a big deal. Aunt Sarah invited everyone. Zoe's family, my other friends, Dr. Torres, even Sergeant Rodriguez from my self-defense class. She ordered a huge cake and decorated our little house with my school colors. I wore my cap and gown for about 1 million photos, smiling until my face hurt. During the ceremony, when they called my name, Mia Crawford, I felt a surge of pride. I'd made it. Despite everything, I'd made it. As I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, I touched the bird pendant around my neck. Free. I was free. That summer before college was one of the best times of my life. I worked at a local bookstore, spent time with friends, and prepared for the next chapter. Aunt Sarah and I took a 2-week road trip to the Grand Canyon, camping under the stars and taking hundreds of photos. Looking out over that massive canyon, I felt small, but in a good way. Part of something bigger than my trauma, my past. Moving to college in Vermont was scary, but exciting. Aunt Sarah helped me set up my dorm room, making sure I had photos and familiar items to make feel like home. Saying goodbye to her was harder than I expected. She'd been my rock, my protector, my real parent in all the ways that mattered. I'm just a phone call away, she reminded me, hugging me tight. And I'll visit in a few weeks for Parents' Weekend. I love you, I told her, words I'd never said to my biological parents because I'd never felt them. I love you too, kiddo, more than you'll ever know. College was a fresh start. No one there knew my history unless I chose to share it. I was just Mia, freshman pre-law student. I decorated my side of the dorm room with fairy lights and photos of me with Aunt Sarah and my friends from Utah. My roommate, Kimberly, was a music major from Chicago with an infectious laugh and an impressive collection of vintage vinyl records. I threw myself into classes, joining study groups and raising my hand in discussions. I signed up for the debate team and a student advocacy group that worked on children's rights issues. I made new friends, went to parties, though I never drank. The idea of not being in control of my body was still terrifying and started to build a college life. There were still challenges. The required freshman health checkup sent me into a panic attack so severe that the campus health center had to call Aunt Sarah. After that incident, I got an official medical accommodation that allowed me to have Aunt Sarah or another support person present for any medical procedures, no matter how routine. I also struggled with intimacy. I went on dates occasionally, but the idea of someone touching my body, even in a consensual romantic context, was complicated for me. My body had been used by others for so long that reclaiming it as a source of pleasure rather than pain was difficult. I started seeing a therapist college counseling center to work through these issues. During my sophomore year, I took a bioethics class that changed everything. We discussed medical consent, patient autonomy, and the ethics of organ donation. One day, the professor brought up a case study about a child conceived to be a donor for a sibling. I nearly walked out of the room, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe, but I stayed listening to my classmates debate the ethics of the situation, my situation, without knowing I was living proof of it. After class, I went to the professor's office hours. Dr. Patterson was a thoughtful woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes. With shaking hands, I told her my story. The real reason I was so interested in medical ethics and children's rights, Mia, she said when I finished, have you ever considered sharing your experience more widely? Your perspective could be incredibly valuable to the medical ethics community. I hadn't considered it. My instinct had always been to hide my past, to try to outrun it, but Dr. Patterson suggested I might be able to use my experience to help, change the system to advocate for other children in similar situations. With her encouragement, I wrote a paper about my experience as a donor child. I changed the names and some identifying details. Core of the story was mine. Dr. Patterson helped me submit it to a medical ethics journal, and to my shock, they published it. The response was overwhelming. I received emails from bioethicists, medical professionals, and even other donor children who had similar experiences. A medical school asked if I would be willing to speak to their ethics class. A children's rights organization reached out about consulting on policy recommendations recommendations. For the first time, I saw how my painful past might have a purpose. I could use what happened to me to protect other children, to change how the medical community approach these cases, to advocate for laws requiring informed consent, even from young donors. I was 25 when I gave my first public speech about my experience. It was at a medical ethics conference in Boston. Aunt Sarah flew in to support me, sitting in the front row as I shared my story with a room full of doctors, ethicists, and medical students. My voice shook at first, but grew stronger as I continued. I talked about physical pain of procedures, the emotional trauma of being valued only for my biological compatibility, and the lasting psychological effects of medical child abuse. When I finished, the room was silent for a moment before erupting into applause. During the Q&A session, a doctor stood up and publicly apologized for times he might not have considered the donor child's perspective fully. Another shared that my story had changed how she would approach similar cases in the future. That conference led to more speaking engagements, more articles, more advocacy work. I changed my major to a double in pre-law and bioethics with a goal of eventually becoming a lawyer specializing in medical ethics and children's rights. I wanted to make sure no child would ever experience what I'd gone through. College flew by. Before I knew it, I was 27 and graduating with honors. Aunt Sarah cheered louder than anyone when I walked across the stage. She'd been there for every important moment, every triumph and setback, providing the unconditional love I'd never had from my biological parents. After graduation, I took a year off before law school to work for a children's rights advocacy organization. I traveled around the country speaking at conferences and medical schools about donor children's rights. I helped draft policy recommendations for hospitals regarding pediatric donors. I even testified before a state legislature considering a bill that would require independent advocates for children in medical donation cases. I was making a difference. The pain and trauma I experienced were being transformed into something positive. It didn't erase what had happened to me, but it gave it meaning. Law school was intense, but fulfilling. I specialized in medical ethics and family law, writing my thesis on the legal rights of donor-conceived children. I interned with a judge who handled family court cases, seeing firsthand how the legal system sometimes failed to protect children's interests. I was determined to change that. Through it all, Aunt Sarah remained my biggest supporter. She'd moved to be closer to me during law school, taking a nursing job at a hospital nearby. We had dinner together every Sunday, maintaining our tradition even as our lives evolved. She'd started dating a kind history professor named Lawrence, and seeing her happy with someone who appreciated her gave me so much joy. I dated occasionally during law school, but nothing serious. My experiences had left me with trust issues that made intimate relationships challenging. I was open about my past, potential partners, but many found it too heavy, too complicated. I focused on my studies and my advocacy work instead, telling myself that romance could wait. After law school, I joined a nonprofit legal organization that represented children in medical and family court cases. The work was emotionally demanding, but deeply satisfying. I was using my law degree and my personal experience to ensure other children had protection and advocacy I'd lacked for so many years. And then last week, a letter arrived. It was the first contact from my father in 10 years. Seeing his handwriting on the envelope sent me right back to being that scared, helpless child. I had been carrying it around for days, unable to open it, but unable to throw it away either. Aunt Sarah offered to read it first, to screen it for anything. That might be too upsetting, but I need to do this myself. I need to face whatever is inside, whether it's an apology, a justification, or another attempt to manipulate me. So I was sitting at the kitchen table, finally ready to open this letter and face my past once more. I took a deep breath and finally tore open the envelope. My hands were shaking, but I reminded myself that I wasn't that scared little girl anymore. My father's handwriting is shakier than I remember, the letters uneven and slanting across the page. I start reading, "Mia, I hope this letter finds you well. It's been a long time. I've been trying to find you for years. I know you probably hate me and I don't blame you. What we did to you was wrong. I see that now. Holly has been gone for 10 years and I've had a lot of time to think about everything. I'm sick, Mia. The same leukemia that Holly had. The doctors say without a bone marrow transplant, I've got maybe 11 months. I know I have no right to ask you for anything, but you're my only hope. We share the same genetics that made you a match for Holly. The doctors say you'd be my best chance. I'm not asking you to do it for me. I'm asking you to do it so I can have the chance to make things right, to apologize properly for how we treated you. You weren't just a donor to me, Mia. You were my daughter too. I just lost sight of that. I'm enclosing my contact information. Please just think about it, Dad. There was a phone number and an address in Phoenix at the bottom of the page. I stared at it for a long time, reading it over and over. I stare at the letter for a long time, reading it over and over. My emotions were all over the place. Anger, pity, disbelief, and this weird sense of deja vu. It was like I was 12 again, finding out he was looking for me as a donor. He wants my bone marrow. I told her he has leukemia. There was was silence on the other end for a moment. Then Aunt Sarah sighed. Oh, Mia, are you okay? I don't know, I admitted. Part of me wants to tear up the letter and forget I ever got it. Another part feels guilty, like maybe I should help him. This is your decision, she says carefully. But remember what we've always said. Your body is yours. You don't owe anyone parts of it, not even your father. After we hung up, I sat with the letter for hours. I decided to sleep on it. By morning, I knew what I needed to do. I needed to see him, not to give him my bone marrow, but to look him in the eye as an adult, to show him that I survived, that I built a life despite everything he did. I booked a flight to Phoenix for the following weekend. I didn't call ahead. I wanted to see his genuine reaction when I showed up at his door. When I got to his place, it took me 25 minutes to gather my courage. But then I went to knock, and when my father opened the door, he looked nothing like I remembered. The strong, intimidating man from my childhood was gone, replaced by someone frail and hollowed out. His clothes were too big for him. His face is thin. His skin, pale. The only thing I recognized were his eyes. He stared at me in shock. Nia, I nod. You came? He whispered. I didn't think you would. I'm not here to donate, I say immediately. I just needed to see you. He nodded slowly. That's fair. Do you want to come in? His apartment was small and sparsely furnished. There was a hospital bed set up in what should be the living room, with IV poles and medication bottles on a side table. The place smelled of illness and disinfectant, that same smell that still triggers my anxiety in hospitals, the home health. Nurse comes twice a day, he explained. It's cheaper than staying in the hospital. I sat stiffly on the couch. You look good, he said. Healthy. I am, I replied. I'm a lawyer now. I work for a children's rights organization. That makes sense. Where's Mom? I ask, realizing I haven't thought about her in years. Michigan last I heard. We divorced right after. He didn't finish the sentence. After Holly died, after they lost their access to me, after their reason for staying together disappeared. Are you in touch? He shook his head. Not for a long time. She blamed me for losing you. I blamed her for Holly. There wasn't much left after that. How did you find me? I asked. It wasn't easy, he admitted. You changed your name, moved away. But I saw an article about you in a medical ethics journal a few years ago. You used a different last name, but I knew it was you. The details matched, and there was a photo. I remember that article. I never thought my parents would see it. I've followed your career since then, continued. The speeches, the advocacy work, you're making a difference. I didn't know how to feel about him keeping tabs on me all these years. It was unsettling, but also strangely validating. At least, he knew what his actions led to. Not just trauma, but my determination to prevent it from happening to others. Why did you reach out after all this time? I asked. He pointed at his frail body. I'm dying, Mia. The same thing that took Holly is taking me. Maybe that's karma. It's genetics. I corrected him automatically. Not karma. He almost smiled at that. You always were the smart one. He knew. I didn't know he knew. We talked for hours. Or rather, he talked and I listened. He told me about the years after Holly died and I left. How he spiraled into depression and alcoholism. How he lost his job, his house, his remaining friends. How he got sober 2 years ago and tried to rebuild some kind of life. How the diagnosis came 11 months ago. I didn't tell him much about my life. I wasn't ready to share those parts of myself with him, but I did tell him about Aunt Sarah. How she gave me the childhood I deserve. How she supported me through college and law school. How she's still the most important person in my life. I'm glad you had her, he said, and he seemed to mean it. We should never have cut her out of our lives. She was right about everything. His breathing came more labored right after, and he winced occasionally from pain. I was going to leave and let him rest, but there was one thing I needed to know first. Did you ever love me? I asked. Not for what I could do for Holly, just me, for myself. He looked down at his hands, were thin and spotted with bruises from IVs. I don't know if I knew how, he admitted. Holly was sick from the time she was 4. Everything revolved around keeping her alive. By the time you came along, I don't think I remembered what it was like to love someone just for who they were. It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was probably the most honest one he could have given. But I did love you, he added in my broken way. I just loved Holly's life more than your well-being. That was wrong. I see that now. I stood up to leave. I'm staying at the Marriott downtown. I'll be here until Monday. He nodded, and I noticed that he didn't ask about my decision about the bone marrow. Not once. Maybe that's growth, or maybe he's just too tired for manipulation. I spent that night in my hotel room researching bone marrow donation. The next morning, I called Dr. Torres, my old therapist. She's retired now, but still takes my calls when I need guidance. I explained the situation, my conflicted feelings, my fear that helping my father might somehow undo all the healing I've done. Mia, she said, the difference is choice. As a child, you had no choice. Now you do. Whatever you decide, it's your decision freely made. That's what matters. I went back to my father's apartment that afternoon. He looked even worse than yesterday, and I wondered if going to see him took more out of him than he let on. I've been thinking about your request, I told him. I understand if the answer is no, he said. I need to know something first. I said, if I don't do this, will you try to make me feel guilty? Will you tell people I let you die like you did with Holly? He flinched at that number. I won't. I've done enough damage to your life. I believed him surprisingly. Maybe because he has nothing left to manipulate me with. Maybe because facing death has given him some perspective. I'll do it, I said. Not because I forgive you. I don't know if I ever can, but because I need to know that I'm not like you, that I wouldn't let someone die if I could help them, even someone who hurt me. The relief on his face was immediate and overwhelming. He started to cry, but I didn't comfort him. He never did that for me. Thank you, he whispered. I have conditions, though. I continue, my lawyer brain taking over. First, I'll only donate through a proper hospital donation program with all the standard protections for donors. Second, this is a one-time thing. If it doesn't work or if cancer comes back, that's it. Third, I don't want a relationship after this. The donation doesn't make us family again. He nodded at each condition, accepting them without argument. And fourth, I added, I want you to write a statement about what you did to me as a child. I want to be able to use it in my advocacy work. No names, the full truth. This one gave him pause. You want me to publicly admit how badly I failed as a father? Yes, I said. That's my price. After a long moment, he agreed. Okay, I'll do it. The next few weeks were a blur of medical appointments. I was tested to confirm I was still a match. I then went through the pre-donation workup. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was back in hospitals being poked and prodded, giving parts of myself to keep my father alive. But this time, every form required my signature. Every doctor explained the procedure to me, asked if I had questions, and confirmed that I'm doing this voluntarily. The actual donation was scheduled for a month after my visit to Phoenix. My father was admitted to the hospital a week before to prepare his body to receive the transplant. I flew back out for the procedure, bringing Aunt Sarah with me for support. Are you sure about this? She asked the night before the donation. I'm sure, I told her. I need to do this on my terms to reclaim the experience. The morning of the donation, I woke up calm. This wasn't like when I was a child where I was terrified and confused. I knew exactly what was going to happen. I had chosen it. That makes all the difference. The procedure itself was just as uncomfortable as I remembered. The large needle going into my hip bone caused a deep aching pain that the local anesthetic didn't fully block, but I breathed through it, reminding myself with each breath that I chose this. My body is mine, and I'm choosing to share a part of it. Afterward, I was sore, but okay. The doctors wanted me to stay overnight for observation. Standard procedure. For bone marrow donors, Aunt Sarah stayed with me, reading aloud from my favorite book like she used to when I was sick as a teenager. The next day, before I was discharged, I went to see my father. He was in isolation to protect his compromised immune system. I had to wear a mask, gown, and gloves to enter his room. He looked terrible. The pre-transplant chemotherapy had ravaged what was left his strength, but there was hope in his eyes. The doctors say your marrow is perfect, he told me. They're optimistic. Good. I wrote that statement you wanted, he said, and weakly pointed to a folder on his bedside table. Everything. The truth. It was hard to put it all down on paper, to see it in black and white. I took the folder, but didn't open it. Thank you, Mia, he said as I turned to leave. I know you said you don't want a relationship. I respect that, but I want you to know I'm proud of the person you've become. Not because of anything I did. Clearly, I did everything wrong, but because of who you are, despite me. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and left. I read his statement on flight home. It was brutally honest, and I was glad to see he didn't make excuses or try to paint himself in a better light. It's exactly what I asked for. 3 months later, I got a call from the hospital in Phoenix. My father's body had accepted the transplant. The leukemia is in remission. He'll need ongoing treatment and monitoring, but his prognosis is good. I felt nothing. Not happiness, not resentment, just a strange emptiness where all those complicated feelings used to be. I didn't call him with the news. The hospital would have told him already. Our transaction is complete. 11 months after the donation, a package arrived at my office. Inside was a legal document. My father had changed his will to leave everything to a foundation that supports children's medical rights. The note attached simply said, "It's not much, but it's something. Thank you for my life." I folded the note and put it away in a drawer. I didn't need his gratitude or his inheritance. I did what I did for me, not for him. I continued my advocacy work using my father's statement, anonymized in presentations about donor children's rights. It was powerful coming from the parents' perspective, admitting the ethical failures that seemed justified at the time. I also started dating someone, Dennis, a fellow attorney who worked on disability rights cases. He was patient with my issues around physical contact. Slowly, I learned to trust him with my body, to believe that intimacy can be about mutual pleasure rather than one-sided taking. I didn't hear from my father again, which is what I wanted. Aunt Sarah occasionally passed along updates she got from the hospital. He was still in remission. He moved to a better apartment. He was doing volunteer work with cancer patients. I listened but didn't respond. That chapter of my life is closed. On the 13th anniversary of the day, Aunt Sarah got custody of me. We had a small celebration, just the two of us, plus Lawrence and Dennis. We called it My Freedom Day. As we were having dinner, Aunt Sarah gave me a small box. Inside was a delicate silver charm to add to the necklace she gave me years ago, the bird breaking free from a cage. This new charm charm was a simple heart because you have the biggest heart of anyone. I know, she explained. Even after everything, you found a way to help the person who hurt you most, not out of obligation, but out of choice. That's real strength. I added the charm to my necklace right there at the table. The bird and the heart hang side by side, representing my freedom and my humanity. The two things my parents never recognized, but could never take away either. Later that night, I finally tore up my father's letter. I didn't need to keep it anymore. It was just paper, just words, and it had no power over me. I was not defined by what was taken from me or what I've given. I was defined by the choices I made freely, by the people I loved and who loved me in return, by the work I do to protect others from what I experienced. My body is my own. My life is my own.